It was me. Not some anonymous city council order, not a cold, legal decree. It was me, Councilman Richard Vance, who with the hammer of my own pride, shattered the little porcelain Virgin Mary my mother kept on her nightstand. I remember the sound it made, a sharp, almost musical crack, followed by the dry rattle of a dozen tiny pieces scattering across the hardwood floor. To my ears, back then, that sound wasn't one of destruction. It was the victory cry of true faith over deception, a sound of liberation. But I see now that sound was just the first crack in the foundation of my entire world. My name is Richard Vance. I'm 52 years old. A man forged in the fires of local politics and the unwavering fervor of my Bible Belt, evangelical faith. I've lived my whole life in this small southern town, where the church steeples outnumber the traffic lights, and where a man's worth is measured by the firmness of his handshake and the conviction in his voice. And I had conviction. Lord, did I have conviction? I believed, with every fiber of my being, that I was a soldier for God, a warrior fighting to purge the subtle poisons of idolatry that had seeped into the soil of our community. My crusade had a name, the Faith and Freedom Campaign, and it had a very specific target. In the center of our town square, there stood a statue. It had been there for nearly a century, a weathered stone figure of a woman with a sorrowful, gentle face, her hands outstretched. To most, she was Our Lady, a piece of local history, a landmark. To me, she was a graven image, a monument to spiritual blindness, a direct violation of the second commandment, carved in stone and placed in the heart of our town for generations to see, for generations to be led astray. This fight wasn't just political for me. It was deeply, profoundly personal. You see, I was raised in the shadow of that kind of faith. My mother was a devout Catholic. I can still see her, clear as day, kneeling by her bed at night, her worn rosary beads slipping through her fingers, her lips moving in whispered, silent prayers. I loved my mother, but I saw her faith as a weakness, a chain. It was a quiet, passive belief system that I felt had held her back, filled her with a kind of gentle melancholy when the world demanded strength. When I found my own faith, my real faith, in a church where the gospel was preached with fire and thunder, I felt like I had finally broken free. I had found the truth, and I was determined to pull everyone I cared about out of the darkness and into that same glorious light. But conviction without compassion is just a weapon, and I wielded mine like a sword. I remember the last real conversation I had with my younger sister, Elizabeth. She's held on to my mother's faith, a fact that I saw as a personal failure. We were in her kitchen, the air thick with the smell of coffee and years of unspoken resentment. I was trying to save her, laying out scripture and theology on her kitchen table like a battle plan. I told her the rosary she wore around her neck was nothing but a superstitious trinket. I told her praying to a statue was no different than the pagans bowing to idols of wood and stone. She just looked at me, her eyes welling with tears. "Richard," she said, her voice trembling, "you've become a zealot. You've taken God's love and turned it into a hammer to smash everything you don't understand." I told her she was lost, blinded by tradition. She told me I had desecrated our mother's memory. We haven't spoken since. That was 5 years ago. Even my own pastor, a wise and gentle man who had guided me for years, tried to temper my zeal. "Richard," Pastor Miller would say, placing a calming hand on my shoulder after a particularly fiery town hall meeting, "remember what the Apostle Paul wrote. Zeal without love is just a clanging cymbal." I would nod and thank him for his counsel, but in my heart I dismissed it. Love, I thought, was telling people the hard truth. Love was tearing down the idols that stood between them and salvation. My love was tough. It was righteous, and it was winning. The day the statue was finally approved for removal was a media circus. I stood on the steps of the courthouse, triumphant, a modern-day David who had felled Goliath. I spoke of victory, of returning our town to its foundation of true, unadulterated faith. I felt invincible. I felt chosen. And as I looked out at the crowd, I saw her, standing at the edge of the square, a silent vigil of one, Sister Sophia, an elderly nun from the local parish. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't holding a sign. Her only weapons were her rosary beads and a serene, unwavering gaze that seemed to cut right through the noise, right through the cameras, right through the armor of my pride. It was a gaze that, for a fleeting, uncomfortable moment, felt less like judgment and more like pity. I dismissed it, of course. What did she know of real faith, of the hard battles that had to be fought? I was the one doing God's work. I was the one who was right. I had never been more certain of anything in my entire life. That was the man I was. So sure of my path, so blind to the cliff I was walking towards. If this story is already speaking to you in some way, if you feel a connection to this journey of pride and the search for something more, I'd be honored if you would subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. And please, give this video a like to help it reach others who might need to hear it. I'd also genuinely love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's a powerful thing to see how far a single story can travel and connect us all. The victory high lasted about 12 hours. It was a potent drug, the adrenaline of public validation, the handshakes, the pats on the back, the reporters shoving microphones in my face. I was Richard Vance, the man who stood for something, the man who won. But like any drug, the effect wears off. And when it did, it left behind a silence that was more profound than any applause. I came home that night to an empty house. The victory felt thin. It was a political achievement, a notch on my belt, but the quiet halls of my home didn't seem to care. The air was still, thick with the scent of old books and solitude. My wife passed away 7 years ago, and my children are grown and gone, scattered across the country, living lives that felt a world away from mine. The triumph that had filled the town square just hours before couldn't penetrate these walls. It was just me, the victor, alone with his victory. I'd been putting it off for months. A task I knew was necessary but dreaded with a quiet intensity. Clearing out the last of my mother's room. It had remained a sort of shrine since she passed, untouched. But my victory felt like a final turning of a page. It was time, I told myself, to finally clear out the old symbols, the old ways. It was an extension of my public campaign, but private, more intimate. I opened the door, and the faint, familiar scent of lavender and old paper met me. I started with her closet, boxing up dresses and coats for donation. Then her books, mostly devotionals and worn-out novels. It was methodical, detached work. I was a man completing a task. And then I saw it. Tucked away on her nightstand, behind a framed photo of my father, was the one thing I had forgotten. A small, porcelain figure of the Virgin Mary. It was the one I'd shattered in my memory. The one that started it all. But this was the real one. The one she'd kept for 60 years. I picked it up, it was cool and smooth in my hand. The blue of her painted cloak was chipped in a few places, and a fine web of cracks ran through the glaze. Her face, though, was serene, her head tilted slightly. her hands held in that same posture of gentle offering as the statue I had just torn down. And in that moment, a wave of something hot and bitter rose in my throat. It wasn't righteousness, it was rage. It was grief. It was the culmination of a lifetime of seeing this thing, this idol, as the symbol of everything that held my mother, my sister, my town, in bondage. It was the root of the superstition I had fought so hard to eradicate. This was the final enemy, the last idol in the last stronghold. It felt like the final battle, the one that truly mattered, fought not in the town square, but in the quiet of a dead woman's room. I didn't think, I acted. My arm rose, my hand clenching the porcelain figure like a stone. I raised it high, my own reflection a distorted mask in the polished wood of the dresser. And with a cry that was more pain than triumph, I brought it down. The sound it made this time wasn't a victory cry. It was a shriek. A sharp, piercing crack that seemed to fracture the very air in the room. And in the deafening silence that followed, as I stared at the white and blue fragments scattered across the floor, the pain hit. It started as a tight band around my chest, a crushing weight that stole my breath. I gasped, staggering back, my hand flying to my heart. A heart attack. That was my first thought. The great Councilman Vance, struck down in his moment of ultimate triumph. But it wasn't my heart, not in the way a doctor would understand it. This was a soul-deep agony. My knees buckled, and I collapsed onto the floor, the sharp edges of the porcelain digging into my palms. I tried to pray. My lips formed the words that had been my sword and shield for decades. I called on the name of the Lord, my fortress, my deliverer. But the words were just sounds, hollow and dead, echoing back at me from the empty walls of the room. There was no comfort, no presence, no answer. The heavens, which had felt so close just yesterday, were now a vault of cold, unforgiving brass. There, on my hands and knees, surrounded by the shattered pieces of my mother's faith, I was completely and utterly alone. The man who had all the answers suddenly had none. The man who stood on stages and preached with unshakable certainty was now a broken heap on a bedroom floor, gasping for a breath that wouldn't come. And for the first time in my adult life, I was afraid. It wasn't a fear of dying. It was a deeper, more chilling fear. The fear of having been wrong. The terrifying possibility that in my crusade to tear down idols, the only thing I had truly succeeded in destroying was myself. I was a man adrift in a sea of his own making, with no land in sight. If you've ever felt that kind of crushing silence when you needed an answer the most, please do me a favor and give this video a like. It helps more than you know. And make sure you hit that notification bell, because what came next, in the heart of that silence, is something I never could have predicted. How long I lay there on the floor, I can't say. Time had lost its meaning. There was only the sharp sting of porcelain in my palms and the cavernous emptiness in my chest. Each breath was a ragged, painful effort. The silence in that room was a living thing, a predator. It coiled around me, squeezing out every last drop of the certainty that had fueled my life. I was a king with no kingdom, a warrior with no cause, a man of God who couldn't find God anywhere. My pride, my righteousness, my entire identity, it had all crumbled to dust, mixing with the porcelain fragments on the floor. I closed my eyes, not in prayer, but in surrender. I had nothing left to say, nothing left to argue. I was simply done. And in that complete and total darkness, in that absolute surrender of the self, something shifted. It wasn't a flash of light or the sound of a heavenly choir. It was quieter, more profound. The smell of dust and old wood in the room began to fade, replaced by something else. Lavender, the faint, unmistakable scent of my mother's perfume. My eyes shot open, but I wasn't in her room anymore. I was somewhere else, or rather, somewhere else. I was small, maybe 7 or 8 years old, lying in my own childhood bed. The room was dark, but a soft, golden light spilled in from the hallway. I could feel the heat of a fever burning behind my eyes, the familiar ache in my bones from a sickness that had laid me low for days. I was weak, drifting in and out of a restless sleep. And then I saw her. My mother. She was kneeling by my bedside, her silhouette framed by the hallway light. She wasn't looking at me. Her head was bowed, her hands clasped together, and tangled in her fingers was that worn, wooden rosary. This wasn't just a memory. It was more real than that. I could feel the cool weight of her hand on my forehead, hear the soft, rhythmic whisper of her prayers. They weren't the rote, empty words I had always imagined. They were a torrent, a desperate, loving flood of petitions poured out into the darkness. She was begging, pleading, offering bargains to heaven for the health of her son. For my health. Her face, when she finally looked up, wasn't the face of gentle melancholy I had condescendingly remembered. It was the face of a lioness protecting her cub. It was etched with worry, yes, but beneath it was a strength, a ferocity of love so powerful it was like a physical force in the room. This was the faith I had called weak. This was the devotion I had mocked as superstition. And in that moment, I saw it for what it was, a love so profound it was willing to kneel in the dark and wrestle with God Himself for the sake of her child. The vision, or memory, or whatever it was, held me captive. I was both the sick child in the bed and the broken man on the floor, watching this scene unfold. And I felt the love she was praying with. It wasn't just directed at the boy in the bed. It washed over the man on the floor. It was a wave of pure, unconditional mercy. It didn't condemn my anger. It didn't judge my pride. It didn't recoil from the ugliness of what I had done. It simply loved me. It saw the broken man, the zealot, the destroyer, and it loved him anyway. And that love broke me in a way my own despair never could. A sob ripped through my chest, a sound torn from the deepest part of my soul. The shame was immense, a crushing weight. I had taken this beautiful, powerful love and I had spat on it. I had called it idolatry. I had smashed its symbol into 1,000 pieces. I was a desecrator, a fool. A son who had profoundly and utterly misunderstood the heart of his own mother. The vision faded. I was back on the floor, the scent of lavender replaced by the cold reality of my mother's empty room. But I was not the same. The silence was no longer a predator. It was just quiet. The emptiness was no longer a void. It was a space waiting to be filled. I was weeping uncontrollably, tears of shame and repentance, and a strange, undeserved relief, soaking the dusty floorboards. And then, a sound cut through the quiet. A sharp, insistent ringing. My phone. It was on the dresser, vibrating against the wood. Who would be calling me at this hour? I ignored it. But it kept ringing, a relentless intrusion into my private Gethsemane. Finally, with a groan, I pushed myself up, my knees aching, my hands raw. I stumbled to the dresser and looked at the screen. The name displayed there made my blood run cold. Elizabeth, my sister. We hadn't spoken in 5 years. Not since that brutal argument in her kitchen. My hand trembled as I answered it. Hello. My voice was a raw, broken whisper. There was a pause on the other end. Then her voice, cautious, unfamiliar after so long. Richard, is that you? Are you all right? I couldn't form words. A fresh wave of sobs overtook me. I just stood there, leaning against the dresser, weeping into the phone. I expected her to hang up, to be angry or confused, but she didn't. She just stayed on the line, listening to her broken older brother fall apart. After a long moment, she spoke again, her voice softer now. "I don't know why," she said, her words a bomb on my shattered soul. "I was getting ready for bed, and I had this overwhelming feeling that I needed to call you, that something was wrong. That was the moment everything changed. If you've ever had a moment that broke you open and changed your entire world, I hope you'll hit that like button. And please, turn on those notifications, because the journey back from that floor was just beginning." I hung up the phone, but my hand wouldn't let go of it. It felt impossibly heavy, a direct link to a world I no longer understood. Elizabeth's words echoed in the silent room. "I just had this overwhelming feeling that I needed to call you." Coincidence? That was the word my mind, my old, logical, political mind, scrambled to find. It was a life raft in a sea of utter chaos. It had to be a coincidence. The stress of the campaign, the emotional weight of clearing out my mother's room, the public victory followed by the private collapse was the perfect storm for a psychological break. A hallucination, that's what the vision of my mother had to be. A grief-induced fantasy, my brain projecting a comforting image in a moment of extreme duress. I've read about things like that. The mind is a powerful thing, especially when it's breaking. I paced the floor, the shards of porcelain crunching under my shoes, trying to rebuild the walls of my certainty. I was Richard Vance. I dealt in facts, in ordinances, in scripture that was as solid and unyielding as granite. I did not deal in ghosts or feelings or mysterious phone calls in the middle of the night. This was an anomaly, a momentary lapse. I would sleep it off. In the morning, the world would make sense again. I would be back in control. But the next morning, sense did not return. The world felt tilted. The light coming through my window seemed different, softer, as if it were passing through a filter I'd never noticed before. And then there was the scent. Lavender, faint but unmistakable. As I poured my morning coffee, I froze, the pot hovering over my mug. I sniffed the air again. Nothing. It was gone. My imagination, I muttered, my voice sounding foreign in my own kitchen. But it happened again. Later that day, as I sat in my car in the City Hall parking lot, trying to summon the will to go inside and face the day, it filled the small space. A wave of lavender, so potent, so real, it was like someone had opened a bottle of my mother's perfume right next to me. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was not a memory. This was a presence. My rational mind was a battlefield. One side, the general I had been my whole life, screamed explanations, its olfactory hallucination. A known symptom of stress, even certain neurological events. You need to see a doctor, Richard. But the other side, a raw, new recruit born on my mother's bedroom floor, whispered a terrifyingly simple question. What if it's real? The shame came next, and it was an acid. It burned away the last of my pride. I started remembering things, moments I had long since buried under layers of self-righteousness. I remembered a Sunday afternoon, years ago, when my mother was still alive. I'd come to visit, and she was sitting in her favorite armchair, her rosary in her hands, her eyes closed. I had stood over her, filled with my new, fiery faith, and I had scoffed. I can still hear my own voice, dripping with condescension. "Mother," I'd said, "why do you still cling to that? Those are just beads. A superstition. Jesus is the only mediator you need." Not that she had opened her eyes, and there was no anger in them, only a deep, bottomless sadness. "Richard," she said, her voice so gentle it was like a feather, "this isn't a magic charm, it's a path. It helps me walk with him, to think about his life, and his mother's sorrow." I had shaken my head and told her she was deceived. I, in my infinite wisdom, was there to correct her. Now, the memory of her sad, loving eyes was a physical torment. I had taken her devotion, her quiet, humble path to God, and I had trampled all over it with the muddy boots of my arrogance. My mind was at war with my soul, and I was losing. If you have ever felt that internal battle, that struggle between what your head tells you is real and what your heart knows to be true, please take a moment to hit that like button and make sure you've turned on the notifications. It means a great deal to know I'm not alone in that fight. I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't go back to being the man I was, and I had no idea how to be anything else. The lavender scent, the phone call, the vision, they were a trail of breadcrumbs leading me somewhere I was terrified to go. For days, I drove around town aimlessly, avoiding my office, avoiding my own home, and I kept finding my car circling the same block, the one that housed St. Michael's Catholic Church. The parish Sister Sophia belonged to, the church my mother had attended her entire life, the place I had seen as the enemy's headquarters. Finally, one afternoon, I couldn't fight it anymore. I parked the car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn off the ignition. Every instinct I had, every fiber of my being, screamed at me to drive away, to go back to the safety of my own church, my own theology, my own answers. But I knew there were no answers for me there anymore. My feet moved on their own, carrying me up the stone steps and to the heavy oak doors. I pushed one open, and it groaned in protest, the sound echoing in the vast, silent space within. I stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind me with a heavy thud, plunging me into a world of cool, dim light. The air was heavy, with the scent of old incense and beeswax, a smell I had only ever associated with error and idolatry. Sunlight, fractured into 100 colors by the stained glass windows, painted the stone floor in jewels of red and blue and gold. It was beautiful, and it terrified me. I felt like a spy, an intruder. I stood frozen just inside the door, expecting to be struck by lightning, or, at the very least, to be thrown out. But the church was empty. There was only me, and the rows of silent, empty pews, and the statues. They stood in their alcoves, their painted eyes staring out into the middle distance. For years, I had seen them as nothing more than carved stone and plaster, graven images, but now I saw the sorrow in their faces, the love, the story. My eyes fell on a statue to my right, a woman in a blue cloak, her hands outstretched, a gentle, sorrowful look on her face, Mary. My heart seized. She looked just like the one I had destroyed. I took a hesitant step forward, then another. My dress shoes clicked loudly on the stone floor, the only sound in the cavernous silence. I reached the foot of the statue and just stared. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to pray to this. It went against everything I had ever believed, but I had to do something. Slowly, tentatively, my hand, the same hand that had smashed my mother's porcelain figure, the same hand that had signed the order to tear down the town's statues. It trembled in the air for a moment, then I reached out and touched the cold, painted plaster of her outstretched hand. The contact sent a jolt through me, not of electricity, but of something else. Peace. The words weren't spoken, but they screamed in my soul. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I didn't understand. I stood there for a long time, my hand resting on hers, and I wept. Not the violent, racking sobs of my breakdown, but quiet, steady tears of release. It wasn't a lightning bolt from heaven. It was quieter. It was a single, clean drop of mercy falling into the desert of my soul. And for the first time in a very long time, the war inside me fell silent. Leaving that church was like stepping out of a tomb and into the blinding light of day. The world looked the same, but I was seeing it with new eyes. And of course, word travels fast in a small town, but gossip travels at the speed of light. My absence from City Hall was noted. My sudden silence on the political front was a mystery. And my car, seen parked outside St. Michael's on more than one occasion, was the spark that lit the wildfire. The calls started coming, first from my political allies, confused, then concerned, then condescending. "Richard, what is this I hear? Spending time with the idol worshippers. Is this some kind of strategy?" When I tried to explain, my words felt clumsy and inadequate. How do you explain a broken soul to a man who only speaks the language of power? Then came the members of my old church, knocking on my door with Bibles and worried expressions. They came in love. I know they did, but it was a suffocating love. They warned me of deception, of the wiles of the enemy who masquerades as an angel of light. They told me my grief had made me vulnerable, that I'd had a psychological break, an emotional hallucination. One of them, a man I had once called a dear friend, sat at my kitchen table and looked me square in the eye. "Richard," he said, his voice earnest, "that vision, that feeling, it wasn't from God. It was a counterfeit comfort, a trap to lead you astray." I listened to them all. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice. When they were finished, I would just look at them, my heart full of a strange new pity, and I would say the only thing I knew to be true: "You can call it whatever you like. All I know is that it was more real than this table between us. It was the most real experience of my life." To some, I was a man who had lost his mind. To others, a man who had lost his soul. But I wasn't lost. For the first time, I was being found. Sister Sophia invited me for coffee in the parish hall. I went, terrified, feeling like a wolf walking into a sheep pen. But no one looked at me with suspicion. They just saw a man who was hurting. They offered me a donut and a weak cup of coffee, and they talked about the church bake sale and their grandchildren. It was so normal, so human. I started attending the daily morning mass. I didn't take communion. I didn't even know when to stand or kneel. I just sat in the back pew, an observer, and I listened. And I began to understand. The rituals I had mocked as empty repetition were a rhythm, a heartbeat. The prayers to the saints weren't worship, they were a family conversation. And a rosary Elizabeth had sent me my mother's, the one she had saved. I held the smooth, worn beads in my hand. It was no longer a superstitious trinket. It was a lifeline. Each bead was an anchor, a way to quiet the noise in my head and focus on a story of love and sacrifice far greater than my own. These symbols I had fought to destroy were not walls blocking people from God, they were windows. And my soul, which had been locked in a windowless room of my own making, was finally getting some light. My true test, however, was yet to come. Our town's annual Founders' Day celebration was held in the very square where the statue once stood, the place of my greatest victory and my deepest shame. I knew I had to go. I also knew I had to speak. When I arrived, the atmosphere was festive, but I could feel the whispers, the sideways glances. I was a ghost at their party. I found the event organizer, a woman I'd known for years, and asked if I could have 5 minutes on the stage. She looked at me like I'd grown a second head, but she agreed. When my name was called, a strange hush fell over the crowd. I walked up the steps, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of my town, my friends, my enemies, my neighbors. "Good evening," I began, my voice amplified, unsteady. "My name is Richard Vance. A few months ago, I stood on this very spot, and I declared a victory." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. I told you we had won a battle for the soul of our town. I told you we had torn down an idol and restored true faith. I was proud, I was certain, and I was a fool. A murmur went through the crowd. I stood here as a conqueror of stone, but I was a complete stranger to grace. I used my faith, my Bible, my position as a hammer. And I smashed things. I smashed relationships. I smashed history. And in the end, I smashed my own soul. My eyes found Elizabeth in the crowd. She was weeping. I am here tonight for one reason: to ask for your forgiveness, for my arrogance, for my intolerance, for the pain my righteous crusade has caused so many of you. I took a deep breath. The irony is not lost on me that the very symbol I worked so hard to tear down, the image of a mother's love I so arrogantly despised, that was the very thing that met me when I hit the ground. It was the hand that lifted me up. I learned that mercy doesn't care about your denomination. It just cares about your broken heart. I stepped back from the podium, the silence of the crowd more deafening than any applause. My public life was over. I knew that. But my real life was just beginning. This journey hasn't been about trading one church pew for another. It's been about trading a heart of stone for a heart of flesh. It's about realizing that faith isn't a fortress to be defended, but a mystery to be lived. It's about understanding that the love I saw in my mother's eyes, the love that finally broke through my pride, is a love that is available to every single one of us, no matter how far we've run, or what idols we've built, or broken. If this story has touched that place in your heart where faith is born, a place where you've felt mercy when you deserved judgment, then please, let this video be a sign for someone else. Give it a like, and make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, because we are all on this journey together. And I want to ask you something personal in the comments. When did you first realize that God's love was bigger than your own rules and understanding? Your story, your single sentence of testimony, could be the very thing someone else needs to read tonight to find their own way home.